Hi, I'm Sarah Fox, and I'm here today to provide a primer on the tree regulations in the City of Camas. I've worked for the city for the past 15 years, and in that time there's been a lot of growth and changes in the city. There have also been a lot of changes in regard to our regulations concerning trees. In this presentation, I'll provide a little background on the city and our roles preserving trees. I will also answer your questions as to who you call at the city when you have a question about trees. I will provide a brief overview of the regulations concerning single-family lots and why it matters if the tree is in your backyard, front yard, or a street tree. I will talk a little bit about how we protect trees in city parks and open spaces. There are regulations that protect trees in wetlands, streams, and steep slopes, which are collectively called critical areas. Those rules apply anywhere, whether it is private or public property. I will wrap up this presentation with a brief overview of the tree regulations on vacant, undeveloped properties and how the city reviews those properties when it comes to retaining trees. For those of you new to Camas, Camas is located east of Vancouver and north of Portland. It is a small town that is about 16 square miles. Approximately 31% of the city is covered with trees. This measurement is also called canopy cover. That high canopy coverage is mostly due to the fact that we have about 700 acres of open spaces and parks. Some of the factors to consider when we are discussing tree protection policies are to look at the current and future land uses in a city. In Camas, about half of the city is zoned residential. Residential includes both single-family and multifamily properties. You will see on the map that those areas are yellow-hued. Our current tree policies protect street trees on residential lands, but typically not trees elsewhere on a lot, unless these are areas within the subdivision such as streams, wetlands, and steep slopes. Then more trees must be preserved in those residential areas. For a better perspective on how much has changed in Camas, I will briefly describe the preservation policies for trees prior to our current regulations. Prior to the adoption of the city's urban tree program in 2018, the city had no street tree protections. We required that every new residential lot plant a tree prior to their building occupancy permit being issued, but we generally didn't have any process to prevent a homeowner who later decided to remove the tree. That's right, the city didn't require permission to remove a street tree or require that they replant another tree after removing it. Tree protections in our parks and open spaces were not clear. The removal of a tree in an open space versus a park was sometimes a civil regulatory order or a misdemeanor. Now, for every instance, it is a misdemeanor. This lack of clarity extended to whether or not the illegal activity would result in mitigating the damage to the area, depending on whether or not the tree was on public or private land, a steep slope, or a stream. The mitigation and fines were different. The permit review process for development of undeveloped properties with trees was incredibly discretionary. Prior to 2018, the city's codes included this phrase, "to the extent practical." What that meant was that a land developer needed to survey all the trees on the properties within the proposed developed area and do their best efforts to keep groves of trees and identify all of the significant trees. It was their burden to show evidence in the record of their best efforts to avoid removing those trees. This process took a lot of work and negotiation between staff and the developers to create a record with multiple iterations of design for each development. This was all in an attempt to prove that their development was infeasible if they were required to save a group of trees in the middle of their site. With all of this said, the standard, to the extent practical, was a heavy lift and arguably ineffective at saving larger trees. And lastly, prior to 2018, we didn't have a tree fund. Now with a tree fund in place, it is a depository for all tree donations and grants, for any money received from the sale of trees or wood from city property, and for fines and penalties from the violations of our urban tree program. Moving forward, the city's first urban tree ordinance was adopted in September of 2018. There was an amazing group of citizens that showed up at the public hearings and testified. We had people of all ages, including our children, stand up and give their reasons for supporting the new regulations. Notably, the new regulations would, for the first time, protect street trees and would provide more uniform protections in our public spaces and parks. Let's fast forward to our current tree regulations. Who do you call when you have a question about trees? For example, if you have a question about a tree in a park or open space that looks dangerous to you, then your call will be directed to our operations department. However, if you're driving by a city open space and you see someone taking a tree down who doesn't appear to be a city employee, then you could call our code enforcement officer. You would also call code enforcement if you witness your neighbor or someone else removing trees in the subdivision open space. It is highly likely that your HOA open space has protections to preserve those trees. If you have less immediate questions or concerns regarding your HOA's open space, street trees, or yard trees, then you should call our planning or engineering departments. We can be reached at the phone number on the screen or at the general email account listed there. Our most common tree questions are in regard to tree preservation within residential neighborhoods. This is the part of the presentation that will answer your question whether or not you need a permit to remove a tree near your home or in your yard. When you phone or email staff, the first thing we are going to ask is, where is the tree? If it's a street tree, then we have a permit process for that. That process is very easy, and we have a permit that is available to download online, or I can email it to you. However, if the tree is in your yard, then the first thing we have to ask is for your address. And then we look up your address and find the recorded plat document. There's quite a few subdivisions in our city that have some unique regulations. Some of those regulations include protecting trees in the backyards, or there might be a common greenway behind the houses. Over time, maybe the property lines have blurred a bit because there weren't any fences to really delineate that line. So staff will just double check if the tree is clearly in your yard or in the protected open space. If you're asking to cut down a yard tree, we make sure that there aren't any of those restrictions on the plat. If you have a property that is larger than 24,000 square feet, then you may need other permits, particularly if your property has a stream running behind it or a steep slope. Critical area review will be needed for those properties. Let's focus for a moment on the process for removing a street tree. As I mentioned, there's information online and a permit application that you can download. Our tree removal application permit looks like this. The form only asks a few questions. You will need to include your name and address, and if you know the name of your subdivision or parcel number, that is also helpful. Let us know if it's a street tree or if it's a protected tree in a backyard or HOA green space. This application is the same for either scenario. There is space on this form for you to sketch your lot, the location of the trees, and adjacent roads. We encourage you to send a photo of the tree. The photo should show us why it is dangerous or why you think it may be dead. If it is not clear to staff, then we'll ask that you have an arborist evaluate the tree and send us a short report or an email to confirm that it's hazardous and why it should be removed. It is very likely that the city will approve the application for tree removal if your property is less than 24,000 square feet and if the trees are hazardous or if they're an inappropriate species. For example, an inappropriate species would be a redwood in a planter strip, or it's an arborvitae or other tree that causes a safety hazard. In those cases, your permit would be approved. After you receive the approved permit and remove the tree, you need to replace the tree with an appropriate species. As I mentioned at the start of this presentation, the majority of the city's tree canopy is within our city's parks and open spaces. The regulations that protect trees in parks can be found in Camas Municipal Code Chapter 1232. Many of our public trees are also protected by our critical area regulations, which are regulations that are an overlay over all areas of the city that are near wetlands, steep slopes, aquifer areas, and streams. We also have specific regulations for our shorelines. In short, if a tree is removed without permission next to a shoreline within a city park, then there would be several layers of potential penalties for that action. Our city has tree protection for a species of tree and for larger sized trees. We specifically protect Oregon white oaks as priority habitat trees, and large trees are labeled significant trees in our codes and are based on the size of their trunk width. The measurement around the trunk is called diameter at breast height, or DBH. The extra protection for a significant tree includes evergreen trees that are at least 8 inches dBH and deciduous trees that are at least 12 inches dBH. Next, let's talk a little bit about our undeveloped and vacant lands. The regulations that control tree removal and protection for vacant lands are generally found in Chapter 1813, which is our landscaping code. There is definitely more clarity for land development now than there was in 2018. Currently, when an application is submitted for site development, the site is required to have a minimum tree density per net acre of 20 tree units. Basically, a new tree is about 2 inches dBH, which means that we require at least 10 new trees per acre. That is a standard for all of our new developments at this time. For a new development, they must meet at least the minimum tree units per acre. If there are trees on site, then the developer will want to know the value of each of those trees in that stand so that they can add them all up and submit the total with their application to develop the property. The Urban Tree Program includes a prioritized list for saving trees within a development site. That was an improvement from prior to the program being adopted. Not only does it value the larger trees, but it gives a higher value to saving trees that contribute to some other environmental benefit as well, such as being near critical area buffers or offers some wildlife habitat or something along those lines. This is an example of a site that has since developed. However, when they brought in their project, there were some existing trees on site and an existing house. It's in a commercial zone, and they were proposing to put a new building on the site, as you can see. The new building is located here, and there's the parking. Every new use, particularly when it's commercial or industrial, are required to provide a certain number of parking spaces on their site. They are also required to provide landscaping around the perimeter of parking lots and internally for shade. In this example, the developer couldn't save any of the trees on site. Sometimes the species are inappropriate for being located next to a paved parking lot or near a building. Sometimes the trees can't be saved once the heavy equipment moves in. Some trees just cannot handle that sort of disruption to their root zones. This site has a minimum of 17 tree units because they aren't quite an acre. If you'll notice, they provided about 21 tree units. It is more typical that a site will provide more than the minimum tree units, given that the city has requirements for landscaping. As I mentioned, the requirements include frontage landscaping and landscaping within the parking lots. This is the reason that there are more tree units provided than required. We will wrap up the presentation today with a quick tour of the municipal code regulations that concern trees. The Camas Municipal Code is available on the web. You can access it from our homepage here. The codes concerning trees that you might want to study in more detail include Title 12, which is our Streets, Sidewalks, and Public Spaces section, Title 16, which is our environmental regulations, and finally you'd want to look at our zoning codes under Title 18. We will tour them in order. Under Title 12, we have regulations concerning our street tree permits that explains who it applies to, and a definition. The definition reads, a street tree is any tree located in the planter strip of the right-of-way unless designated in another location as noted on the face of a plat or other approved development plan. Moving on to Title 16. I mentioned that this title includes all of our environmental codes. The general rules protecting our critical areas is at Chapter 1651. This chapter includes the process for receiving permission to remove a tree within an open space or a critical area, and when there are conditions on a plat that state that the area remain in its natural state or something along those lines. The process is called a vegetation removal permit. We require that the tree be evaluated by an arborist or professional forester. We usually don't require pages of reports, but an email with an evaluation will do. And then if the tree is dangerous and you feel it might hit a structure like your fence or your house, then it will be approved. For this permit, you will be required to replace the tree. New trees will need to be planted in the open space to replace the one that was lost at a ratio of 2 trees for every tree removed. Title 18 is our zoning code. The relevant chapters that pertain to trees can be primarily found at Chapter 1803, which is our environmental definitions, and within Chapter 1813, which is our landscaping code. For an undeveloped property, the regulations within our landscaping code are most pertinent. That is where you'll find the standards for tree units. Thank you for joining me to learn more about the regulations that protect trees in the City of Camas. If you have any questions on anything that I've covered today, please reach out to me or other city staff. Thank you.